We moved to 1915 and a few events occurred around this year. The Anzacs were born and thrown into the hell of Europe for World War I. The early closing bill of 1915 was established after a mob of drunken light horsemen rioted through the streets of Liverpool and Casula, leading to pubs being closed at 6 p.m, creating the old 6 o'clock swill. 16-year-old Matilda Twist meets 21-year-old Big Jim Devine on the streets of London. Billy Hughes becomes Prime Minister. Petrobus wins the Melbourne Cup. And of course, the historical beginning of women in the police force. 220 police officers were conscripted and volunteered to pick up arms for the war. The rise was so rapid that it put an unbearable strain on the remaining numbers of the force and led to a special government decree being placed so that there were no further enlistments from the police force. Those police that did enlist after the decree were made to resign from their rank and post with no guarantee of being reinstated upon their return, if they were even fit to do so, ultimately penalising them for their bravery and determinations, their commitment to their country, unlike other civilians. Of those sent away, 46 lost their lives. In their absence, and with a growing demand for more female representation from influential women's organisations in all aspects of the community for dealing with certain phases of crime and delinquent girls, State Colonial Secretary George Black caved and would only agree to women's recruitment as an experiment and that no extra money would be granted for services for policewomen in the force. This was following in the footsteps of the United States, where in 1910 they employed the first ever policewoman with arresting powers, Alice Stebbin Wells, in Los Angeles. Then in 1914 Britain, with a British Women's Police Service made up of volunteers. Australia knew that the world was progressing away from tradition, so for these reasons, as well as the rise in crime against women and the inappropriate methods of which male officers used towards women and children, the New South Wales government decided to put plans in motion to place an ad for only 2 women to be employed for the experiment, which was then also encouraged and backed by the head of the New South Wales Police Department, James Mitchell. In July of 1915, Lillian read the ad in the paper looking for 2 female police officers to join the ranks of the New South Wales Police Department. The ad stated women needed to be under 30, with fair education, of good character and address, capable of enduring hardships and fatigue in execution of their duty. Preferred women were working as nurses or in asylums. It also paid 7 shillings and 6 pence per day. This was the moment for her to make a difference, but little did she know of the impact that reading this ad in 1915 would have on the entire world today. Lillian, Maud, and around 400 other women from New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and even New Zealand sent in applications. And after a grueling interviewing process, Special Constable 64 Maud Marion Rhodes and Special Constable 65 Lillian May Armfield were selected for duty. Even though Lillian at the time was 31 instead of the required 30, it was stated by the officer conducting her interview that she was very tactful and intelligent, shrewd and capable, her character undoubtedly good, and a very suitable candidate. One newspaper described Lillian as being tall and well built, with a smile that would surely help her to win her way into the hearts of the women whom she'll have to deal with. Maud's resume was just as impressive as Lillian's. English at birth, studied and worked in London, looking after young girls in state care. She chaperoned 50 young women on a boat from the UK to New Zealand and became inspector for the State Children's Relief Department. Fairly soon after the appointment of Lillian and Maud, some of these women's groups became dissatisfied with the lack of progression and action displayed by the New South Wales Police. But a lot of the work they were doing, which was a fair amount of work at the time, was done behind closed doors and in secret, as to not expose their positions within the community. Questions were asked and answers were demanded on the roles of these women in the force. When asked by Mr. Hosking what are their duties, the reply came with the following quote by Colonial Secretary Black: "To keep young children from the streets, especially at night. To assist in the prevention of truancy from school. To watch the newspapers and to put the detectives on track of those who are apparently endeavouring to decoy young girls by advertisement or by other means. To patrol the railway stations and wharves when long-distance trains and steamers come in order to guard and advise women, girls and children who are the strangers and have no friends waiting for them. To patrol the slum neighbourhoods, to look after drunken women and to obtain assistance of their neglected children. To keep eyes on the houses of ill fame and on the wine shops and hotels frequented by these women in town in order to prevent young girls from being decoyed and drugged with liquor and entrapment. In addition to these duties mentioned, all inquiries in connection with charity matters, where it is described that the inquiry should be made by police in plainclothes, are handed to the women police for inquiry and report." And this seemed to satisfy the groups for a time. Other jobs they had were to look after victims of botched abortions, looking for victims and perpetrators of human trafficking, keeping watch over opium dens and enforcing pedestrian traffic laws. These women were the only frontline preventative measures for young, vulnerable girls and women. They were to aid in undercover work so the men could sweep in and arrest the criminals and culprits of assaults against women, which were rapidly on the rise. These are things that Lillian saw way too much of in the asylum, and the main driving factor for her work in protecting and serving while being treated without the same equal respect and oftentimes working more harder than the men on the force. A sexual assault conviction could lock up a bloke for a maximum of 15 months, then they'd be back on the streets to do it all again. The lack of weapons and uniforms was said to protect these women from more serious harm and to help disguise them while being undercover, at least before word got out about women on the police. This caused more backlash within the community, especially with heavy criticism from those women's organisations that were in support of this change. They felt that not enough was being done and that women were more or less acting in the same manner as the men, and though that may have been true, they were acting as per the guidelines and rules that were already in place. But they had more important jobs as decoys. They became the secret weapons in gaining access to secret bars, opium dens and brothels that would be impossible for a man. Publicity was the enemy for these two women, so the less the public knew about them, for a time, the better it was to crack down on serious crime. Though at all times, each woman was shadowed by 2 male officers to do the arresting and to pull them out in case of serious danger. But Lillian was a tough country girl going up against the weak criminals of Sydney who preyed on the vulnerable. So with a signature pearl necklace and varying skirts and dresses, she'd lure the unsuspecting crims to take advantage of her and oftentimes leaving them worse than second best, to the point where the male officers would have to come in and arrest her to save the men from a more savage beating. As tough and as strong as she was, Lillian was also soft, compassionate where it was needed most. Women didn't talk to the males because they often felt unsafe and unheard, so reporting crimes would often be neglected until it was too late. Lillian would sit for hours talking to offenders and victims while they waited to be processed at the station, just to get to know them a bit better. This was another way to build her relationship with the women and girls of Sydney. The women of the streets would see Lillian as a woman battling in a male-dominated world, and empathy was formed and gained her respect. Some of these women would later on become reliable informants. It was up to Maud and Lillian to canvass the streets, becoming approachable figures for women and girls suffering from violence, addiction and neglect. They also brought back confidence in the police when criminals would try to convince wayward women and girls that the police were only out to arrest them for running away from home. The first place to search for girls in need was on the dawn patrols invented by the pair, and they began at Central train station. Many who needed help were young runaways, escaping from their homes mostly in country towns and mostly after typical arguments with their parents about freedoms and adventures. These girls would board trains with their small amounts of pocket change and head to the big city to exercise their independence and sense of adventure. Distraught families would send pictures of their missing girls to the police in Sydney, where the female officers would receive them and get in touch with every woman they knew around the city trying to find these wayward girls. Once a runaway would arrive in the city, they'd often be overwhelmed by the change in scene. The smells, the noise, the amount of people would have confused many, leading to traffickers like Salvatore Bouar and Savoy Tabul, and women like Iris Furlong, Kate Lee and Tilly Devine to pick them up, offer them a place to live in exchange to work as drug peddlers or prostitutes. Out of shame, fear and some exhilaration, these young girls would remain trapped in the life of the underworld. Other young women would escape from their homes to hide secret pregnancies from their families, or to seek abortions in the city where strangers wouldn't ask questions. These often took place in the back of unsanitary houses and then dished out on the streets to fend for themselves or to die. Now, once a girl was found by Lillian, she would offer them clothes, access to work and money just to get them away from the criminal haunts. Lillian believed that very few girls were bad beyond redemption. There were some like Nellie Cameron, the girl with the kiss of death, and pretty Dulcie Markham, the fallen angel who didn't want to be saved. Then there were some girls who tried to return to their homes, victims of trafficking, escaping from their handlers, and children of the stolen generation would be found wandering through the streets. However, through intergovernmental procedures, the focus only went to non-Indigenous Australians. Lillian's early years were tough on the job, dealing with some of the biggest names in drugs and prostitution, such as Chinese opium lord and brothel owner Chidi Ah Fu, who grew to despise Lillian until his deportation. She went up against the likes of Nellie Grogan, a known associate and bondswoman for crooks, French call girls Madame Louise and Madame Marie, whose King's Cross establishments were too tempting for runaways, white slave traders with Frenchmen Salvatore Bouar and Savoy Tabul importing European women, and Iris Furlong, described as a wife stealer and sexual deviationist. These are just to name a few. But the biggest enemy for a time wasn't just the crooks and sex workers. Lillian hated the fortune tellers. During the wartime period, clairvoyants, palm readers and fortune tellers made their fortunes as desperate families would seek guidance and news on their loved ones in Europe. They'd often receive false hopes, pure lies to embellish the sobbing mothers to extract as much money as they could. Young women were among the most easily affected when it came to these tellers. They would advise them of their husband's or boyfriend's unfaithfulness, or news of potential children in marriage to their new beloved, only to have their partners beg them for a false forgiveness, beg them for being believed, or to leave them not long after these hopeful readings, which led to depressed girls taking their lives for the betrayal that they had or would potentially receive. Lillian thought this to be more disgusting than selling your soul on the streets of Sydney. So her and Maud would put the pressure on as undercovers, seeking their fortunes as desperate young girls, leading to many of these operations being shut down and tellers weary of who would walk through those doors. Lillian would joke later on that if they were real fortune tellers and psychics, they'd have known that I was a police officer. 1919 would change Sydney forever. Tilly Devine arrived in Sydney as a war bride at the age of 19 and began her reign as the most vile woman and brothel queen in Sydney. Notorious cocaine dealer Botany Mae Smith was ramping up her control of cocaine trade in the streets. Kate Lee was released from her 7-year stint in Long Bay to begin her empire in Sly Grog, and Maud Rhodes quits the police force with alleged clashes between herself and Lillian. Without Maud's presence, Lillian had to dig in deep and fight for herself and women on her own, and she did so with her own style and grace. From 1919 to 1929, the war between Kate and Tilly ramped up, and so did the crime. Lillian had destroyed Botany Mae Smith, which left the market open for cocaine to any contender. Kate swept in to pick up the pieces of what Botany Mae had dropped, then Tilly Devine and Phil Jeffs would pick up the pieces of what was left. Returned servicemen from World War I suffering from undiagnosed PTSD returned to a city falling apart. Displacement and poverty would drive these men to commit crimes just to survive while also retaining their firearms. Kate ruled the Sly Grog trade after the 1915 referendum, which forced the closure of pubs after 6 p.m, saying that she was providing a community service in providing alcohol after hours at around 15 to 20 secret locations around the city. There was more snow on the streets than Thredbo, prostitution was on the rise with Tilly's empire growing, leading up to 29 brothels around the city, and anyone with money and a family left the squalor and moved to the inner west, away from the decaying centre, which was then replaced by the worst kinds of cockroaches and rats you could imagine. Firearms were banned in 1927, which led to razors being used as a sign of fear, control, and defence, thus beginning the razor wars. 1929 saw the Depression hit Australia, and if things weren't bad enough, they were going to get a lot worse. Families would be out of work. People would lose their homes. Men would have to travel far and wide out of the city just to find work, leaving mothers to manage at home as best as they could. Desperate times call for desperate measures, for the innocent at least. The underworld was thriving on the chaos and enjoyed the spoils of war. This began Lillian's own war against the city. Corrupt cops stank out the Criminal Investigations Bureau, and the Vice Squad began its internal conflict. Runaways and delinquent teenage girls were bad enough before, but with husbands and fathers dead from the war, injured, or working far away to feed their families, the women and girls would be left at home starving and desperate, so they looked for more opportunities for money, food, safety, and fun in the city. For the rise in such violent crimes and a massive social shift, Lillian was allowed to carry a firearm for her own safety, and was the only female police officer to do so until the 1970s. But this didn't stop her from hiding a gun in her purse illegally, which came in handy on a number of occasions. It was never fired, but was used to apprehend suspects, like in the case of 2 men, Neville Harris and William Brawner, who on the 6th of September 1926 were held by Lillian outside their residence for the kidnap and assault of a young woman in North Sydney. They tried to escape, but Lillian stood strong and firm until backup arrived. The men were arrested, charged, and eventually was sentenced to 10 years of hard labour in prison.